On paper, Montana is the fourth largest state in America, about 147,000 square miles of space. In real life, barely over 1 million people are scattered across it, like sparks in a dark field. And up in the north, a place called Glacier once held roughly 150 named ice bodies in the mid-1800s. Yet today, only a fraction still meets the definition of a glacier. The land looks eternal, but its memory is melting in real time. So what happens when a big sky begins to feel like a countdown? And who has been listening to this landscape long before any road border or postcard tried to explain it? Montana is often introduced with a nickname, Big Sky Country, but the sky is only the final layer of the story. The first chapter is written in stone and collisions and slow motion pressure that never made a sound yet rearranged an entire continent. In the west, the Rocky Mountains rise like a spine. In the east, the land relaxes into the Great Plains, wide open and deceptively simple. Between them lies a kind of borderland where weather ecosystems and even human imagination shift in a single day's drive. In the far northwest, Glacier National Park feels like a place built by blades. Valleys have the smooth, scooped shape of a giant hand dragging through wet clay, classic U-shaped scars that glaciers leave behind. Lakes hold a pale, milky turquoise that comes from pulverized rock glacial flour suspended in the water. And above those lakes, steep walls of layered sedimentary rock stand like stacked pages, each band a different era, each color a different chemistry. Then comes the detail that makes the mind pause. Here time appears flipped. In what is known as the Lewis Overthrust ancient rocks, roughly 1.5 to 1.4 billion years old, were pushed up and over much younger rocks around 70 million years old. The result is a geological illusion. Older stone resting on younger stone, as if the planet briefly forgot the order of its own history. That flip is not just a technical fact, it's a theme. Montana is full of places where the surface looks calm, but the foundation tells a story of violence stretched across incomprehensible time. And in Glacier, the rock itself becomes a museum of ancient shallow seas and slow sedimentation materials laid down long before these mountains existed as mountains. But geology doesn't stay locked in textbooks. It becomes weather. It becomes roots. It becomes the way a person's breath catches when a valley suddenly opens up. One of the most cinematic examples is Going to the Sun Road, surveyed, carved, and engineered to cross the Continental Divide at Logan Pass. Work began in 1921. The road was completed in 1932. And it was formally dedicated in 1933, an audacious human line stitched through avalanche country and sheer rock faces. And yet, even as roads and overlooks make the landscape more accessible, the landscape itself keeps moving quietly, relentlessly. The United States Geological Survey has documented a time series of retreat for the named glaciers inside Glacier National Park, tracking changes in area since 1966. The point isn't a single dramatic number. It's the direction of the line shrinkage decade after decade, visible enough to feel like watching a clock run down. Montana's geology isn't only about ice and thrust faults. It's also about water, where it begins, how it chooses a direction, how it becomes a map you can't fully see from above. In the southwest, near the town of Three Forks, three rivers, Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, merge to form what is historically recognized as the start of the Missouri River. It's an origin point with a quiet power, three separate currents agreeing to become one, then running for thousands of miles through the interior of North America. That confluence isn't just scenic. It explains why people moved the way they did, why trails became roads, why certain valleys became gateways. Rivers don't simply carve landscapes, they carve choices. And in Montana, those choices are often made under the shadow of elevation mountains that trap weather planes, that invite wind passes, that decide what can travel and what must turn back. Even the idea of Montana depends on these contrasts. West of the divide, moisture and forests feel closer, heavier, more intimate. East of it, the horizon stretches like a promise and a warning at the same time. The land becomes less vertical, but more exposed storms arriving like armies, cold snapping down without shelter. In one state, the viewer can watch the continent's skeleton change shape from alpine drama to prairie scale. And that's the deeper truth behind the big sky. Montana isn't one landscape. It's a meeting place of ancient rock and young rivers, of glacial chisels and human engineering of mountains that lift the weather and plains that let it run wild. The terrain looks permanent, but it is still in motion. Ice retreating rock, shedding rivers, redrawing their edges in small, patient increments. So if the ground itself is never truly finished, what does stable even mean here? If Montana's geology is the skeleton, its ecosystems are the pulse. This is a place where the same day can carry two different worlds, damp evergreen shade in the west and sun-scorched grassland, wind in the east. And that split isn't just visual. It decides what can live here, how it survives, and what kind of silence you hear when you stop talking long enough. In the far northwest around Glacier National Park, life feels like it was designed for steepness. forest climbs in layers cedar and hemlock in wetter pockets, lodgepole and fir, where the air sharpens, then subalpine meadows that bloom for a brief fierce window before winter returns. In summer, the slopes flash with wildflowers, like a secret the mountains can't keep. Then the season turns, and everything tightens, snowpack, cold hunger endurance. This is also where Montana's most iconic animals feel less like wildlife and more like moving history. Mountain goats pick their way across near vertical rock as if gravity is only a suggestion. Bighorn sheep stand like statues on ridgelines, scanning the world with a stillness that looks almost ancient. And in the deep timber, the presence of a grizzly is often felt before it's seen fresh tracks in mud, a ripped log, a sudden quiet in the birds. Here, survival has a weight to it. Not dramatic, not romantic, simply real. Water is the other language of this region. Cold rivers braid through valleys, carrying snowmelt into lakes that look almost unreal in their color. Under the surface, trout hold in currents that never quite warm up. Around the edges, beavers alter entire neighborhoods of the forest-building wetlands that become nurseries for insects, amphibians, and birds. Montana's wilderness is not a postcard. It's a working system. Everything connected, everything paying attention. But Montana doesn't stay alpine. Drive east, and the world opens wider, drier, more exposed. The forests thin, the mountains fall behind, and the land becomes a different kind of beautiful long grass, sagebrush, and sky. Out here, the drama isn't vertical cliffs. It's distance. It's the way storms can be watched for an hour before they arrive. It's the way the wind has nothing to interrupt it, so it just keeps going, shaping how plants grow and how animals move. On these plains, pronghorn can appear like quicksilver, built for speed, built for open space. Coyotes work the edges between grass and brush like cautious opportunists. Raptors hover and drop with sudden precision, reminding the viewer that even the quiet places have sharp rules. And in sage country, the story becomes more fragile. A bird like the greater sage grouse depends on a habitat that looks empty to the untrained eye sagebrush sees, that are actually complex, seasonal, and easily broken by roads development and invasive plants. When that habitat fragments the whole ritual of life mating displays, nesting survival starts to unravel. So Montana offers a question that's harder than it sounds. What counts as wilderness? Is it the mountain basin with no cell service, or the prairie where nothing seems to happen until you realize everything is happening just quietly. Then comes the ecosystem that behaves like a myth, with scientific footnotes, the greater Yellowstone region. While Yellowstone National Park itself sits mostly in Wyoming, its living web spills into Montana, especially near places like Gardner and Cook City, where valleys become corridors and animals refuse to respect state lines. Here, the landscape is alive with movement, bison pushing through snow as if it isn't there, elk shifting in response to weather, and predators, bears cycling through seasons of feast and fasting. This is where Montana's biodiversity becomes a story of balance and how easily balance can tilt. For much of the 20th century, the absence of certain top predators in parts of the region changed the behavior of herbivores, and that changed the land. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in the mid-1990s, it didn't solve nature like a switch being flipped, but it did reintroduce pressure-fear movement forces that ripple outward. Elk herds began to spend less time lingering in certain valleys and river bottoms. In some areas, that shift allowed willows and aspens a better chance to regenerate, which then affects songbirds, beavers, and the shape of waterways over time. Not every study agrees on every detail, and ecosystems never follow a simple script. But the larger point holds in Montana's neighborhood of the greater Yellowstone. One species can rewrite the behavior of many. And that's the emotional power of this region. It makes the viewer realize that the land is not a backdrop. It's a negotiation, constant dynamic, sometimes brutal, often stunning. There's another truth Montana quietly insists on. Not all biodiversity is charismatic. Some of the most important life here is small, seasonal, and easy to miss. Pollinators that arrive at the exact week the wildflowers open. Amphibians that need clean wetlands that don't dry too early. Cold water fish whose survival depends on streams staying cold enough during longer summers. When the climate shifts, even slightly, timing becomes fate. And in Montana, climate pressure doesn't always announce itself as a catastrophe. Sometimes it arrives as a warmer river at the wrong month, a lower snowpack that melts too fast, a summer that stretches longer than the forest can tolerate, a fire season that starts earlier and ends later, turning blue skies into smoke-filtered light. The animals adapt where they can, moving higher, moving north, changing routines. But the land has limits, and Montana is increasingly forced to reveal where those limits are. Still, despite the tension, the state remains one of the rare places in modern North America where large ecosystems still function across huge distances. That doesn't mean it's untouched. It means the connections are still visible. Predator and prey, snowmelt, and river grassland, and migration forest, and fire. Montana's biodiversity is not just a list of species. It's a living argument that space matters and that wildness, when given enough room, becomes a kind of intelligence. So the question that follows isn't only what lives here, it's this: if Montana's wildlife depends on movement, on corridors, on the freedom to roam, how does a modern world learn to make room for something that refuses to stay in one place? Long before Montana was a state, before it was a territory, before it had highways or county lines, it was something else entirely, a living instruction manual. The wind taught direction. The rivers taught timing. The mountains taught patience. And the earliest human presence here goes so far back that the numbers start to feel unreal, measured not in centuries, but in tens of millennia. In the Shields River Valley near present-day Wilsall, archaeologists uncovered what is widely described as the only known Clovis-era burial in the Americas, often referred to as the Anzac site, dated to roughly 12,600 years ago. It's not just a headline fact, it's a reminder. Humans weren't new to this landscape when the first wagon ruts cut into prairie soil. People were here when the world still carried Ice Age shadows, when the herds were different, when survival demanded an intimacy with weather that modern life rarely asks for. But Montana's human story isn't a straight line. It's more like a braided river. Many currents, many origins, some visible, some hidden beneath the surface, until the land chooses to reveal them. Some of that story comes through archaeology, campsites, tools, hearths, ochre stains in the soil. Some of it comes through oral tradition histories, carried in language, in song, in the way a place name holds more meaning than a map can print. Across the plains and river valleys, the rhythm of life was often seasonal, moving with food, water, and shelter. In a place where winter can arrive like a locked door, planning wasn't optional. It was culture. People learned to read the land the way others read a calendar, where the bison would be, when the rivers would swell, where the berries would ripen, when the first hard freeze would make travel dangerous. Few images make that relationship as visceral as the buffalo jump. Near Great Falls, the site known today as First Peoples Buffalo Jump preserves the idea of a hunt as a community act, strategic, coordinated, and deeply respectful of what it provided. Drive lines guided herds toward a cliff. Below, the work continued in disciplined efficiency, meat, hide, sinew bone. Nothing wasted, because waste in this climate was a kind of arrogance. It wasn't simply hunting. It was engineering cooperation and spiritual responsibility intertwined. And then there are the quieter traces, painted images in places like Pictograph Cave near Billings, where rock art spans thousands of years. Some figures are animals. Some are human forms. Some include later images that reflect the shock of new technology and new conflict. Even without decoding every symbol, the message is unmistakable. People were watching, recording, and remembering. Montana was never empty. It was witnessed. When the conversation turns to Montana tribes, it's easy for outsiders to reduce that complexity into a list. But a list is not a worldview. The indigenous nations of what is now Montana include, among others, the Blackfeet Niitsitapi along the northern plains and mountain front, the Crow Apsalaluk with deep ties to the Yellowstone River country, the Northern Cheyenne, the Assiniboine and Sioux communities of the Northeast, the Gros Ventre Ani and Assiniboine at Fort Belknap, the Chippewa Cree at Rocky Boys, and the Salish Kootenai and Pandarei peoples of the Flathead region. Each holds its own languages, origin stories, kinship structures, and sacred geographies, distinct nations, not a single culture, wearing different names. The land shaped those cultures in different ways. Along the plains, bison economies shaped tools, clothing shelter, and mobility. Teepee architecture wasn't just practical. It was intelligent design for a world where wind can be relentless and seasons demand movement. Along river corridors, fishing and riparian life created different routines. In the mountain valleys and forests, knowledge was often tied to plants' roots and the careful timing of harvests. And across it all, the most advanced technology was often the least visible memory. Knowing where a storm will break, knowing which ice is safe, knowing how to move a camp without leaving scars that invite trouble. Then over time, new forces moved into the system, some natural, some human. One of the most transformative was the horse. Its arrival across the plains reshaped mobility and hunting, altering the range and tempo of daily life. It expanded trade networks. It changed how people traveled, how quickly they could respond to threats, how far a hunting party could go, and still return before weather turned. It wasn't simply an animal added to the story. It was an engine of cultural change, powerful, liberating in some ways, destabilizing in others. Trade routes also stitched the region into a wider world long before formal borders did. Stone for tools traveled. Shells moved inland. Metal later arrived, and with it, a cascade of adjustments, new opportunities, new dependencies, new tensions. But even as materials changed, the deeper structure remained relationship to land, to animals, to water, to ancestors. The environment was not an object to be owned. It was a relative to be negotiated with. And here is where Montana's early human story becomes especially important to tell with care, because early doesn't mean gone. These nations are not museum exhibits. They are living communities whose presence continues often through enormous pressure displacement and the repeated attempt of outside systems to redefine them. Even in the oldest traces, there was a modern echo. The Anzac burial, for example, became a point of deep discussion in recent decades about consultation stewardship and how scientific curiosity intersects with human dignity and tribal sovereignty. A site can be an archaeological discovery, but it can also be an ancestor. The question isn't just what happened 600 years ago. The question is who gets to speak for that child now. In Montana, the idea of place is inseparable from identity. A river bend isn't only water, it's a story. A mountain isn't only elevation, it's a boundary. A teacher, sometimes a sacred being. And the land holds layers, buffalo jump cliffs, beneath modern fences, pictographs, beneath modern signage, ancient trails beneath asphalt. To travel here without acknowledging that is to miss the true scale of Montana, not just physical size, but historical depth. So when later explorers arrive with journals and flags, and when settlers arrive with surveys and claims, the documentary question becomes sharper. Not who discovered Montana, but discovered it for whom. Because long before the first expedition wrote it down in English, the land was already named, navigated, prayed over, and remembered. And that sets up the next chapter with a kind of inevitability. If this place was already full of life, law, and meaning, what happens when another world arrives and insists the land should mean something else. In Montana, history doesn't arrive like a single event. It arrives like a weather front first, as distant movement, then as pressure, then as a full change in the air. For centuries, this land was already being traveled and understood through indigenous roots and relationships. But the moment the wider Atlantic world began writing Montana into its own story, the pace changed. The questions changed. The stakes changed. In the early 1800s, the American push westward started turning rivers into highways of ambition. When the Corps of Discovery, better known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, moved through the region in 1805 and 1806, the landscape became a corridor of recording journals, maps, measurements, descriptions of plants, animals, and people. The Missouri River and its headwaters weren't just beautiful, they were strategic. A confluence wasn't just water meeting water. It was a promise of passage. And yet Montana had a way of humbling even the most determined movement. The Rockies were not a gentle rise. They were a wall, a test of endurance, a place where distance stopped being a number and became a feeling. Winter could trap travelers like a door slamming shut. Rivers could swell and steal supplies. Food could become a daily calculation. Exploration here was never only about courage. It was about vulnerability, how quickly a human plan can shrink under a big sky. But exploration is rarely neutral. Every new route, mapped by outsiders, carried consequences, new trade patterns, new competition, new pressure on animals that had once moved according to older rhythms. The fur trade surged across the northern west, turning beaver pelts and buffalo robes into currency. Trading posts and river towns became nodes in a growing network, places where goods, languages, diseases, and conflicts traveled together. Montana was being connected whether it wanted to be or not. And then, as the mid-1800s approached, a different kind of lure began to pull people into the valleys, not furs, but minerals. Not trade, but extraction. The land wasn't only something to cross anymore. It was something to take from. Gold changed Montana's tempo, the way wildfire changes a forest. Suddenly, the quiet places were loud. Rumors became migrations. Creeks became crowded. Camps became towns, sometimes overnight, sometimes with the kind of lawlessness that grows when people arrive faster than rules conform. Places like Bannock and Virginia City entered the story as gold rush settlements, names that still carry the feeling of lantern-light mud streets and a constant suspicion that fortune could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Helena rose from gold discoveries too, and for a time, it was the kind of place where the ground itself seemed to glitter with possibility. But that possibility had edges. It brought conflict over land, water, and authority. It amplified violence, and it accelerated the displacement and confinement of indigenous nations through military campaigns, broken agreements, and policies designed to clear the way for settlement. Few events symbolize that collision more sharply than the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876. It is often told as a single dramatic episode, but the deeper truth is heavier. It was one moment in a longer struggle over sovereignty survival and the right to exist on ancestral land. The aftermath didn't resolve anything. It intensified the machinery of expansion. In the years that followed, the pressure increased. The frontier, as outsiders called it, was not an empty edge. It was a contested homeland. By 1864, the Montana Territory was created and the formal structures of American governance tightened. Survey lines arrived. Legal titles arrived. Railroads began to promise an industrial future. The West was being converted into property, into profit, into a system that measured land more by what it could produce than by what it meant. And if gold was the spark, ranching became the long burn. The open range era spread across the plains, cattle moving like dark rivers, cowboys working under weather that never negotiated small settlements, forming around supply points and rail stops. It was a myth-making machine, wide hats, endless horizons, independence as identity. But the reality was less clean. Harsh winters could erase herds in a single season. Barbed wire turned open space into fenced claims. Conflicts over grazing rights and water access hardened into a new kind of frontier tension. Not guns at noon, but lawsuits, boundaries, and quiet resentment. So Montana's late 1800s became a transformation story, from movement to settlement, from seasonal rhythm to permanent infrastructure, from land as relationship to land as commodity. And still, the biggest change hadn't fully arrived yet, because beneath the mountains, another resource waited, one that would build cities' fortunes and scars that never completely heal. That resource was copper. And if gold brought people in, copper kept them there because copper demanded industry. It demanded labor. It demanded machines, smelters, rail lines, and an entire workforce willing to go underground. Nowhere embodies that era more than Butte. For decades, Butte was a name spoken with a particular mix of awe and exhaustion. often called the richest hill on Earth, a place where wealth was pulled from the ground in staggering volumes, and where the cost was paid in dangerous work, industrial pollution, and the constant tension between capital and labor. This wasn't a romantic frontier. This was the industrial West, grimy, mechanical electric. Butte's story is also a story of people. Immigrants arrived from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, China, and many other places drawn by wages and the hope that hard work could become a new beginning. In the boarding houses and saloons, languages mixed, communities formed, churches rose, unions fought. The city became an engine of American modernity, and it ran on human bodies as much as it ran on ore. And then there is the image that lingers, an image that looks like the earth has been scooped out with a cruel spoon, the Berkeley Pit. What began as open-pit copper mining in the mid-20th century eventually became one of the most infamous environmental scars in the United States. When mining stopped in the early 1980s, groundwater began filling the pit, creating a lake of highly acidic metal-laden water. It's a place that forces a documentary to ask uncomfortable questions. How much progress fits inside a hole? How much damage becomes normal when it happens slowly enough? How long does a landscape remember what people did to it? Not far away, another kind of modern infrastructure tells a different side of Montana's development dams and reservoirs built to tame rivers and generate power to irrigate fields to turn seasonal water into predictable output. Projects like Fort Peck Dam on the Missouri River, built during the New Deal era, changed communities and ecosystems alike. Montana's development was never one simple line. It was mining, ranching, railroads, dams, timber tourism, layer after layer of human intention laid on top of a much older land. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Montana became a state in 1889, its future tied to American politics and economics, but its identity still deeply shaped by distance weather and the stubborn reality of geography. So when modern travelers arrive today and see charming downtowns, mountain towns, national parks, and postcard valleys, they are seeing the surface of a deeper timeline. Indigenous homelands, exploration routes, gold fever, copper empires, labor battles, fenced prairies, rail lines, and environmental aftershocks. Montana wasn't built in one era. It was layered, sometimes carefully, sometimes violently. And that leads directly into the present tense. Because the question now isn't only how Montana was changed, but what it is becoming. When glaciers shrink, when wildfire smoke stretches the summer, when tourists arrive by the millions to the region's doorstep. What does Montana even mean in the 21st century? In the 21st century, Montana is still sold as a promise room to breathe silence. You can hear a horizon that makes ordinary problems feel smaller. But the modern era has a way of testing even the biggest landscapes, not with one dramatic collapse, but with pressures that arrive season after season, a little earlier, a little louder. One of the clearest shifts is fire, not just flames, but smoke. Across the western United States, researchers have tied rising fire weather to a warming atmosphere that becomes thirstier, pulling moisture from soils and plants. NOAA has described how climate change has been a main driver of increasing vapor pressure deficit, a measure of atmospheric thirst in the West in recent decades, conditions that make fuels more flammable and fires harder to control. In Montana, the modern wildfire problem isn't only about what burns, it's also about what people breathe. The Montana Climate Assessment notes that increased fire activity in recent decades has meant more hazardous air quality from wildfire smoke, sometimes from local fires, sometimes from distant ones, producing longer smoke events. And local public health messaging has even coined a term that sounds almost too calm for what it describes: smoke waves, defined as 2 or more days of unhealthy air, expected to become longer, more intense, and more frequent as fire season lengthens. So the big sky has a new version of itself. Some summers, the blue becomes a filtered gray. Sunsets burn orange, not from beauty, but from particles in the air. People who came for open space find themselves sealing windows, running air filters, checking air quality alerts like a weather forecast. And the question becomes painfully modern. What happens to an outdoor identity when the outdoors becomes unsafe? But climate pressure is only one side of Montana's modern tension. The other is popularity. The wild places that once felt remote now sit inside a global algorithm tagged, shared, rooted, and pursued. Yellowstone, just south of the Montana line, has become a symbol of that surge. In May 2025, the park reported its busiest May on record, and year-to-date visits through May were up compared to 2024. Those visitors don't stay neatly inside a boundary. They spill into Montana's gateway towns and roads, into hotel shortages, traffic lines, crowded pullouts, and trailheads that fill before breakfast. A landscape built on patience starts being consumed at modern speed. Glacier National Park, Montana's northern cathedral of ice and rock, has been forced to adapt to that same reality. In 2025, the National Park Service required timed entry vehicle reservations for certain areas including the west side of Going to the Sun Road and the North Fork during daytime hours. It's a management tool, but it also says something deeper. The era of just show up is fading in places where beauty draws crowds faster than infrastructure can stretch. And it creates a strange new contradiction for a viewer to sit with wilderness that must be scheduled. At the same time, Glacier carries a quieter pressure that no reservation system can solve. USGS research has highlighted the time series of glacier retreat in the park glaciers receiving intense attention because they're a clear indicator of change in the northern Rockies. NASA's Earth Observatory has also described the long arc around 1850. There were about 150 documented glaciers in the area, while today the number of ice bodies is far smaller. So visitors arrive to see something timeless. And what they're really seeing is time-moving ice, shrinking seasons, shifting the park, becoming both sanctuary and warning. Yet Montana's modern story isn't only damage and crowding. It's also resilience culture and rebalancing, sometimes in ways that don't make headlines. On the Flathead Reservation, for example, the Bison Range was officially restored to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes by Congress in 2020, with the site now owned and managed by CSKT's Natural Resource Department. That matters in a documentary because it reframes conservation as more than protecting scenery. It becomes a question of stewardship sovereignty and whose knowledge is treated as expertise. And then there's daily life, the Montana that exists when the cameras leave the overlooks. Ranch families still measure years by drought and winter kill. Tribal communities keep languages and ceremonies alive while navigating modern economies and modern politics. Mountain towns wrestle with growth cost identity and the uneasy feeling of being loved too much by people passing through. In places like Butte, the industrial past is still visible, and the land still asks hard questions about what progress leaves behind. So Montana's present tense is a tightrope fire seasons and smoke waves, melting ice, and timed entries, economic opportunity, and cultural strain, tourism that funds communities, and tourism that overwhelms them. Under the same sky, people are trying to keep what makes Montana Montana, space wildness and meaning, without turning it into a theme park version of itself. Because in the end, the most modern question here isn't how beautiful is it? It's how do you keep a place wild when the whole world wants to stand inside the same frame? Montana has a way of making the modern world feel small, not because it erases people, but because it reminds them what existed before their timelines ever began. Here, the mountains still carry the slow memory of uplift and ice. The rivers still practice patience, carving and recarving their edges without asking permission. And the sky still stretches so wide it can make a person feel both free and exposed at the same time. But this landscape is not a museum frozen behind glass. It's a living system, and lately it's been speaking louder. Glaciers thinning into smaller shapes. Summers learning the color of smoke. Wildlife pushed to move, adapt, reroute. In human communities, ranch towns, gateway towns, tribal nations, families who've lived here for generations, trying to keep their footing as the pressure rises from every direction at once. That's the real edge of the world feeling Montana delivers. Not a cliff at the end of a map, but a boundary between two ideas, a land that once felt endless, and a future that is suddenly measurable. Measurable in shrinking ice, measurable in crowded pullouts, measurable in fire seasons that don't know when to stop. So what is the right way to witness a place like this? Maybe it starts with humility, with slowing down, with understanding that wilderness is not the absence of people. It is often the presence of older relationships, names, carried in languages, stories attached to ridgelines, traditions that treat land not as a backdrop, but as a relative. It continues with practical choices, traveling responsibly, staying on trails, respecting wildlife distance learning, before posting spending money in ways that support local communities without overwhelming them, and listening especially to voices that have been here longest. Because Montana doesn't need more people to discover it. It needs more people to understand it. And if there's one lesson this big sky offers, it's this awe is not the final emotion. Awe is the beginning. The question that follows is what that awe turns into care, restraint, respect, protection, or just another photo taken fast and forgotten faster. So when the viewer finally drives away, when the last mountains sink behind the mirror, Montana leaves one quiet question hanging in the air like a prayer. If the land is changing right in front of us, what will it remember about the ones who came to see it?